Why should we focus our work in nutrient density on animal protein? What is dark matter of nutrition, and why did Eric Jackson, after a successful career, not retire but took on the board chair of the BioNutrient Food Association? Third time on the show, but the last time was 3 years ago and in a very different role. He's been working in regeneration for so long that it's always great to check in with him about nutrient density, the research, the practical implications, but also about soil carbon credits. Mind you, he worked on one of the first ones in 2008, cell-based and plant-based meat replacements, and so much more. Enjoy! What are the connections between healthy farming practices, healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut, and healthy people? Welcome to a special series where we go deep into the relationship between regenerative agriculture practices that build soil health and the nutritional quality of the food we end up eating. We unpack the current state of science, the role of investments, businesses, nonprofits, entrepreneurs, and more. This series is supported by the A-Team Foundation, who support food and land projects that are ecologically, economically, and socially conscious. They contribute to a wider movement that envisions a future where real food is produced by enlightened agriculture and access to it is equal. The A-Team Foundation are looking to make more investments and grants in the space of bionutrients. You can find more here, ateamfoundation.org, or get in touch directly, info@ateamfoundation.org, or check the information in the show notes below. Welcome to another interview. Today we're going to dive deeper and deeper into nutrient density, and we're doing that with a friend of the show who has been in, I had to check my notes, has been on the show twice before, which I do remember, has been on a few webinars as well, but it was 2018 June and 2019 July, which feels like an eternity and actually is. He's officially retired, but absolutely didn't stop with working. Luckily for the sector, we have Eric Jackson back on the show, who's now the board chair of the BioNutrient Food Association. And we'll definitely link, of course, the other interviews with Eric before in his previous life and also other interviews we've done with Dan Kittredge. But I'm very happy to look at the lay of the land today, what's happening in nutrient density with Eric. So welcome back.
Thanks, Koen. It's good to be back here once again. And I can't believe it's been almost 4 years, huh?
Let's not mention that again. Let's just go to the everyday situation. What would you say? I mean, you mentioned in the pre-conversation a bit. What's your feeling of this whole nutrient density or bionutrient discussion and conversation we've been having in the fringes for a long time, but has something materially shifted? Is it still very niche? What's your overview of where we're at with this conversation? We're recording this in the beginning, February 2023. What's your lay of the land at the moment? Where are we?
Yeah, I mean, as I did mention in our pre-conversation, I think it's very interesting to see how many folks are starting to pick up on the theme of nutrient density as a concept, right? I mean, it's still, there's a lot of definition that needs to occur, but I don't think that gets in the way of at least a general understanding about food quality, which is what really nutrient density, at least initially, is about. You know, what causes food quality to increase or decrease? It's tied, nutrient content is tied directly to flavor. So there's also a culinary aspect to this that's quite interesting. So we see some culinary folks that are looking into the subject matter. We see the healthcare sector is, you know, particularly post-COVID or almost post-COVID, is quite interested in, you know, how nutrition affects, particularly the non-communicable disease, you know, of human health. And agriculturalists are starting to take notice. So, you know, my primary goal in this whole sector is to bring agriculture, food, and healthcare into the same room and have those conversations go where they might. But now, independent of the work that we're doing at BioNutrient Food Association, other efforts are popping up, and that's great. The more, the better. We need all hands on deck to try to, you know, peel the onion on this and try to understand, A, what does nutrient density mean, and B, how do we affect nutrient density in our foods?
And what would you say, like, what's the status of the science from your perspective now at the beginning of 23? Like, where are we in terms of understanding what nutrient density means, or also just the variations in the density of the nutrients, or the variation of the good stuff in food? How far are we along?
Well, I mean, the headline is we're still very young, very early in this whole endeavor. When we started the work at the BioNutrient Food Association, and this certainly precedes me, Dan Kittredge and the team have been at this for a while. The initial question was, is there a high degree of variability in nutrient density of various foodstuffs? Because if it's not obvious, 5% here, 10% there is not terribly interesting. But what we've discovered is that there are, certainly in the category of phytonutrients and minerals and secondary metabolites, which are the true health-giving substances in foods, that there's variations sometimes up to several hundred times higher, right, between two bunches of spinach or two bunches of carrots. So it's staggering, quite frankly, and we were quite surprised at those results. And we've repeated those results several times. So we're confident that kind of variability exists. So now the obvious question is, why?
Why?
Why? And now when you start getting into how many variables there are in food production, right, you can understand the complexity that we're up against now in terms of trying to figure those things out. So I think as we move forward, the important knowledge that will be gained will be that there will be, certain categories of agricultural practices, which include genetics, as well as on-farm practices, that clearly indicate a higher degree of nutritional density in the foodstuffs that come off of those farms. So we're going to continue to try to pinpoint some very specific scientific ideas, but then also be able to generalize categorically things that are then perhaps useful at the consumer level, right? Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is have a mechanism by which the healthcare community, the agricultural community, and the food community can use a common language to discuss these things.
And so what is the path forward, or what are the most exciting pieces of that? Is it the animal protein side? I mean, we've looked with Stefan van Vliet, or is it the spinach or a superfood, the kale? Like, or shouldn't we think in those specific categories? What do you see, not only in your work, obviously, but broader, the path forward in this discussion?
Well, we are a bit fixated on the animal protein side right now, partially because it's a huge category. If you take a look at food spend in the food service world and in the consumer world, animal protein accounts for a very large portion of the spend, 40% approximately of the overall spend. It also is, if you think about particularly ruminants, particularly cattle, and the land use component of those animals, it's quite exciting to think about what can be determined in terms of practices that both impact nutrient density as well as ecosystem outcomes, right? So, and I think that animals are sort of in the crosshairs right now from a lot of different sectors, and people are obviously can have their own opinions. We'd like to make sure there's some facts out there as well about the importance of animals in the system as part of a system, and then what it means not only at the agricultural level but also at the human health level. The animal protein sector is one of the more direct farm to human consumption products, mostly. Mm-hmm. There's obviously many hyper processed products out there that that I'm not really talking about.
But maybe less. Yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of less processed. It's a huge acreage compared to veggies, which we often think about, and it's absolutely in the crosshairs of the on the environmental destruction side, and at the same time a growing, I think, enthusiasm in terms of the health benefits of keto diets and other things, like very extreme voices, let's say there. And so there's a lot of tension around it, without often asking the underlying question: how was that animal grown, or what did the animal eat, and in what way, etc. Which is the nuance we always have to add there. So it's definitely it's a big one to tackle from multiple angles.
Yeah, I mean, grains obviously occupy a huge amount of acreage as well, and they're very
work. Yeah.
Part of the problem is that grains are typically, not always, but typically very processed, right? And so what you find out at the farm level does not necessarily carry through to the human consumption level. Whereas what we
Is
discover
it
in
something you
animal
discovered now? Like the more layers of processing, let's say, mean potentially less direct connection between the health side and the farming practices, and that's less interesting to unpack at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say at the moment. I mean, ultimately, when I'm going to say when, but perhaps the point is if we start testing at the consumer level, at the packaged consumer level, then those things might come to the forefront. But at this point, we're more focused on things that are likely to be less processed between the farm and the human consumption. And then you immediately think about, to your point, the acreage involved, because if our early discoveries, which tend to indicate that the types of farming practices we like to see from an ecosystem perspective also lead to higher quality foodstuffs, if that idea persists through the research, then what we have is an opportunity to sell high quality foods to people who want to eat high quality foods, whether or not they care about the ecosystem outcomes, right? Yet knowing along the way that we get those ecosystem benefits. And study after study has shown that only a small fraction of consumers are actually making choices based on environmental components of agriculture, right? A lot of people choose organic because they believe that to be chemical free, but that's about as far as most of the choice making goes when it comes to people actually laying down money for ecosystem services at the retail level. But they will certainly, and again, this has been proven in study after study, both flavor, which is also tied to nutrient density, and quality, which is tied to human health. They're willing
flavor,
to pay.
Of course, in less processed. I mean, the more processed it gets, the more you're being duped with flavor. But of course, the least processed you look at, the more flavor comes through from literally soil to plate. So there's another argument for that. And just you mentioned free of chemicals. You've made a great framework together with David Lizaks and Mandy Ellerton. I will link the white paper below of the human health nexus in regenerative agriculture. Can you walk us through those 4 levels, that we have a bit of a framework to think about nutrient density, and that there's even a world beyond, and the level 4, which is very exciting. What can you walk us through that framework so we can place, for instance, the organic you just mentioned?
Well, I mean, yeah, and I'm going to go a bit from memory here. I haven't reviewed that for a while, but as I recall, the first level
I have the notes here.
The first level, as I recall, is what we call the substitution factor, right? And clearly, no matter what kind of spinach, for example, you eat, regardless of the nutrient density of that spinach, it's better for you than French fries. I'll just pick on French fries, right? So the substitution factor is sort of the most obvious one, and where we spend most of our time talking about today. And that includes things like getting rid of salt in the diet, getting rid of saturated fat in the diet, getting rid of trans fats in the diet. So it's mostly an elimination factor, if you will, of things that are known to not be nutritious for human consumption if taken on a daily basis, right? The second level would be, I would say, remind me, is it the chemical-free side?
The free of chemicals and drug inputs, you wrote, yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting because level 1 is often where we stop and say, okay, but if everybody just eats enough veggies, fibers, fruits, and that will be fine, which many people will be a lot better. I'm not saying fine, but will be a lot better. Right. And there are a few more levels, in this case, the free from chemical and drug inputs, which takes it a step further.
Yeah, and there are many organizations that are really focused on this, right? There are labels that are coming out, glyphosate free, for example, labels, free from chemicals, but maybe not actually labeled as organic because they don't meet the rest of the standard of organic. Chemicals have such a ubiquitous impact on everything that they touch, right? And I think that agriculture has tried not to be poisonous to humans and has tried not to be poisonous to the environment. But unfortunately, study after study, challenges those assumptions, right? And so if you can free the food system from chemicals, you're obviously impacting the entire biosphere in which agriculture is practiced. You're impacting water quality, and then you're impacting, the human side of health and the animal side of health. And chemicals.
I'm going from memory, but we covered that quite a bit, I think, or it was one of your answers to or the magic one question I asked before years ago, or what would you do with $1 billion? Like getting chemicals out of food.
Yeah.
And ag, I think, was your answer, if I remember correctly. Somebody's going to correct me if this is wrong, but so that's level 2, like getting less in, let's say, and then level 3 differentiated on the nutrient density, which is what we're talking about here, which is more talking about I think somebody quoted it, like what's in it and not what's not in it.
Yeah, correct.
And that's where we're playing now, basically, or what we're starting to discover or starting to discuss now. Like, okay, great, the chemicals are out, now what?
Yeah, and I mean, so when chemicals come out, then you're actually looking at a natural system, right? It hasn't been influenced by chemicals. So there's still a ton of complexity, but at least you've eliminated, one family of variables, if you will, and that's the synthetic chemistry side. Now, chemistry is obviously part of natural systems, so certainly chemistry is going on in the natural system. But if you can eliminate the synthetics and then focus on what are the set of practices that create the highest opportunity for nutrient density, which clearly includes genetics of the crop, right? Whether it's an animal or a vegetable or a fruit, genetics certainly play a role. But yes, zeroing in on what is in the products and how do we optimize for the desirables, right? How do we identify, where do we get stuff that is perhaps better for us than other stuff? And it's quite an exciting field. There are people who are taking the research much more deeply than even we're doing it, through the BioNutrient Institute, which is our research arm at the BioNutrient Food Association. There are folks studying, the dark matter of nutrition. That's a phrase that has come up, in the last couple of years.
What's the dark matter of, or maybe we have to ask them, but what do you understand is the dark matter of nutrition?
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert in this area, but there are folks that are, they've looked very precisely at the 2,000 or so compounds that are in foodstuffs. And when you think about the USDA reports about 150 of those, right? The dark matter would be the other, would be the other, 1,850 compounds that aren't really listed, and understanding the activity between all of these compounds, right, is quite an endeavor, and certainly, again, a very nascent field of study. So that, like with anything, an individual component might be interesting. The phytonutrient component might be interesting, right? But understanding how all of these things interplay together, both in the setting of agriculture, in the setting of food, and in the setting of human health, is quite complex. And so, this field of computational nutrition has emerged that is studying not the nutrition of dark matter, but also sort of a molecular mapping of food and trying to understand what it all means, and that will carry on at its own pace. That's being done, partially under. I think folks at Tufts are working on this. I think folks at the USDA are working on it, and I'm sure there are other people that are engaged as well. But yeah, the study of what's in our foods and how it gets there, and what does it leave behind, right? And so when we talk about the ecological component of this, if you're growing a crop, it's part of a living system. It's not just an individualized thing that sits outside of the system. What is that system outcome, right? What is the healthy plant? What does it give back to the overall system, right? So it's a two-way, more than a two-way. I mean, there's an atmospheric exchange, there's a hydrologic exchange, there's a chemical exchange in the soil, right? Which then leads you to level 4, which is the interesting, to study about the microbiome, right? And
because then the question is, how do we absorb that? Like, what is it's amazing to have something full of nutrients and flavor, but can we actually absorb that? And I'm not saying these level 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the different stages we go through in research, I think they're all happening parallel. There's a lot of work being done in parallel. So what do you see at that level 4, which sort of feels the beyond nutrient density level? And like, can we actually absorb it in our body and quote unquote put it to work, or put it where it wants to be? What do you see there?
Yeah, again, another very lofty goal is to understand how the human microbiome works, what impacts the human microbiome, what enables the human microbiome, what disables the human microbiome, right? Clearly what we ingest is critical. And so looping back around to the chemical side of things, I think we've had this conversation before, but there's been a lot of people that argue that glyphosate is not harmful, right, to mammals. But the problem is the Shikimati pathway, which is part of the human system, acts more like a plant pathway than an animal pathway. And it is deeply affected by glyphosate. And glyphosate is a disabler of an important part of the human microbiome. So it's a very interesting field of study. So if you can look at the microbiome from a system level view, which I think is what the attempt is, and also understanding that there's a soil microbiome, right? And what's the connection between those two? There were some early studies done where children who played in the dirt, right, would pick up certain microbiological features that helped them stay healthy, as long as they weren't playing in dirt which was chemical laden, right? So what are these connections is still a very, very young field of study, but I think an important one, because we have now the computational power, right, to be able to do things at a much faster speed and a much lower cost than we had just a few years ago when we studied the human microbiome initially, right? Or the human genome initially, right? Those were extremely expensive, very slow, relatively speaking. Amazing science, but now we have tools that are, much, much faster and much, much cheaper. So we're able to ask increasingly hard questions and try to get to the bottom of some of these, current mysteries. I'm sure the mysteries will continue to compound, but the mysteries that we're studying today, the good news is I think we have tools that enable us to get to some answers much faster. And then stitching it all together, right? I mean, these fields of study have an interrelated component, but they're not being done necessarily in the same room at the same time, right? So the ultimate challenge will be to create data sets that are useful across all these various disciplines, and that we can continue to dig farther and farther, for the benefit of society and for the benefit of the planet.
And do you feel that these four, they're almost also like four pillars of people working on it, or four silos? Is the conversation starting to happen also more under one umbrella, as in soil, sort of, I don't know, getting a healthy soil connects them all or something? Or are people really, okay, the chemical free labeling people, the microbiome people, are they at all talking to each other? Do you see any of that? Or is it relatively siloed in terms of, okay, I'm fighting for more veggies in diets, I'm fighting for, regardless of where they come from, I'm fighting for chemical-free stuff, I'm focusing on nutrient density like you do, or no, I'm actually focusing on the microbiome part of this because that's the crucial bit? Or do many people see it as one continuum or one connected tissue?
Well, there certainly are a lot of specialists engaged, right? And by definition, they specialize. Like I mentioned before, funding tends to go in one direction or another, and the more specialized you can, explain what it is you're trying to look at, the better chance you have of getting funded. Whereas if you broadly say we're studying this, this huge area of interest, people may or may not decide that that's worthwhile for funding. So, you have the funding aspect of it, but then you also have certainly the opinion aspect of it. So unfortunately, a lot of folks who I think would agree on 80 or 90% of the topical ideas wind up disagreeing about some things that I think are not important, but they do, right? And so we have sort of a food fight going on between it's at some level the vegans and the carnivores, right? I mean, we've got a this whole plant-based area of endeavor right now, which has received a lot of funding, right, and sparked a lot of imagination. And I think people should be, able to eat whatever it is they can afford to eat. But on the other hand, I don't think that it's doing anybody any good if we don't really understand what the nutritional value is of these various foodstuffs. But people are dug in. So some of those opinions have already built walls and moats, and it's hard to get across all of those. So I think it's still a lot of silos, to directly answer your question. But there are a few of us who are trying to be non-opinionated, and trying to at least keep the doors open between the various, corridors and chambers in this massive area of ideas, and because nobody has definitive research that can absolutely say something at this point that would completely defile the others, right? We're all still very young in this, no matter which position you came to this from. Nobody has definitive research that can prove anything other than, I would argue, and again, this is partially due to my opinion, I would argue that the chemistry side, I think, is becoming clearer, because it's relatively easy to test, because it either is or it isn't, right? And because it's not part of a natural system, you can do some black and white comparison between chemistry.
Like the negative side of chemicals in food and ag, or the chemical residue, or what do you mean by making
both.
It's
both.
easy, but
both. I mean, you because you can either include chemicals in the production system or take them out of the production system. You either have agricultural land that is tainted with chemicals, or you have agricultural land that is either virgin from chemicals, other than atmospheric, which is still a factor, but which hasn't been directly applied to, or has healed itself over the course of time, due to the practitioner doing certain things. So you do have some black and white opportunities for testing in that environment.
Do you see that as dangerous? As like Regen Ag gets quite a bit of pushback now from especially the activist side, and they have a point of that big corporations are sort of hijacking the term, and of course putting everything under it what they would like to see. So maybe a bit of no-till with quite a bit of spraying and calling it regeneration. Is the push for this nutrient side of things and the chemical side, etc., chemical-free side, is that an answer to that, or part of an answer to the potential downplaying or regen washing, or whatever we want to, like, diluting of the term regenerative, which of course we haven't defined as well, which probably for good reasons. But there's a lot of interest, let's say, to also make it slightly less regenerative from certain aspects, and like chemicals, yes or no, is quite a black and white thing, as you said before. Is that part of an answer there?
Well, I think the closer we can get to outcome-based measures as opposed to process-based, right? To me, the less controversial things become, because by definition, outcomes are measurable. You can name them. The metric may not be perfect. That can always improve over time, right? The way that you do the measurement, you may be able to get to modeling as opposed to direct measurement at some point, which then becomes very convenient if that is true. But the outcome-based concept, to me, is ultimately where the whole discussion needs to go. And so chemicals, yes or no, right? It's clear. Residue, yes or no, it can be measured, right? Nutrient components, yes or no, and to what degree, right? Those things can be measured. And again, this is very early in our research, but there tends to be the results that we have to this point tend to indicate, and I don't want to be definitive because a lot more research has to be done, but tend to indicate that those things that we would say are good for the environment are also good for food quality, right? And intuitively that sounds fine, but we still have a lot more research that needs to be done. And if we can put our finger on that, then there's a possibility that food quality becomes the single biomarker for the entire system.
And like, for instance, carbon. Yeah.
People can say they did this or they did that, but if you test their food, right, I don't really care from a process standpoint. And that's the other challenge is if we try to define a set of processes, right, and every farm is so individual in terms of its, parameters. We try to define a set of processes rather than a set of outcomes, then I think we're working against ourselves. I think we'll be able to categorize some processes that will tend to improve food quality and ecosystem services. But I think that if we can get to a point where measuring food quality is the reliable indicator of both the processes that preceded that food, right, and the human health aspect that post-seeds, if you will, right, the food consumption, I think we may have discovered something glorious. But there's so much work to be done before we can get to that point.
And how likely or easy would it be, or is it to cheat with that? Like, what's the argument of how can we do all our tricks with processed food to get to the level of nutrients or we would like to see? Do you see any first signs of that? Because I'm betting somebody's going to try.
Somebody is always going to try. If there's a premium involved, if there's a market share involved, right, you're always going to have folks that are trying to figure out how to play within the very loose rules of the game, right, and put themselves in a better position. But I think that there are certain outcomes that can only be generated by natural systems, and as far as we know today. Even with gene editing, even with all the current, trickery that can go on in an attempt to manipulate, there are certain things that only occur in natural systems. And to the extent that those are the things that we are focused on, I think it'll be a long time before somebody can get away with this idea of presenting, I'll pick on spinach again, or on beef, on presenting a product that mimics a natural system, but that wasn't done in nature. The lab-grown meats are maybe a good proxy for the discussion right now, because lab-grown meats fall far short in terms of their nutrient component. They claim to have the same flesh and blood, so to speak.
Yeah, I was going to say, everybody, like when you read the announcements or the headlines, it says we have exactly the same. It's the same from a nutrient perspective. What is your answer to when somebody says, yeah, but it's the same? Why wouldn't you choose that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's much testing to be done to be able to make that claim. So it's easy to make a claim, right? It's much harder to refute the claim. The research is what's going to have to tell us the story. But if you think the logic through of, an animal eats, an animal converts, an animal becomes, right? Try to mimic that in a petri dish. Try to mimic that in a vat, right? What is the animal consuming in a vat?
Sugars,
right?
Yeah.
So I think that if we stop testing at protein, fat, moisture, and fiber, if that's all of the farther we go, that's not telling us really much of anything. Available protein. What is the amino acid profile, right? What is the fatty acid profile? What are the phytonutrients and secondary metabolites? Are there even any secondary metabolites, right? What is the metabolism that creates these products? How does that get mimicked in a fermentation tank? Those are things that have to be well understood. And so if people say, yeah, well, we have the same protein level in our lab grown food as what you would find coming off the farm, that may be true, but it's an insignificant point. It's an insignificant point because protein as a single measure is almost meaningless.
So also the level of research needed, and that's something I think I still remember from having Anne and David on, like a lot of the nutrient claims or even food claims we've done over the last decades maybe went like a few centimeters deep to stay in the soil analysis and never went a meter or 2 meters. And now we're discovering that the real interesting stuff are very small quantities, but much deeper hidden within, but you absolutely need them not to survive, because most of us, fortunately, it depends where you listen to this, but are in a position to get enough food in to survive. But to thrive, we absolutely need those. And we're only just starting to discover the other 1,850 that we didn't really measure until now, and we have no idea how they work together. So yeah, making that claim of it's the same as is very easy, but not very easy to state or to build upon. So we're going to have to do a lot of testing. I think it's going to be very interesting to see those early results and just to unpack, but also it's going to be difficult to teach the general consumer that you have to look beyond protein and sugar levels, or beyond 2 or 3 things. Now it's a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, it's much more complex. And again, I don't want to deprive anybody of the choice that they want to make in terms of what they eat. I just want people to be as informed as possible about what it really is that they're consuming. And the natural systems produce an amazingly complex set of outcomes. And mimicking a natural system is not to be taken lightly. And you can do things in a controlled environment, like a vat, that can produce a mock-up of what a natural system creates. But to your point, you can't lay claim to having produced something that's exactly the same as a natural system. It doesn't.
Do you see a role for that kind of tech, or that kind of precision fermentation and a lot of the cellular stuff in the food system in general? Maybe not for the complex things like growing a steak in a vat, but something much more on the vegetable oil side, or much more on simpler, quote unquote, because nothing of this is simple. Do you see a role of that high tech in the food and ag system?
Here I have to try to be really careful not to be too opinionated. I think technology always has a role to play. How technology is used and for what purpose sort of determines its efficacy, right? And we've been really, really focused on efficiency, and I think, sacrificed resiliency as a result of that efficiency. And technology has enabled the efficiency. Technology has yet to prove itself to be able to enable resiliency. So I think that's where the baby's going to get, split, is going to be along those lines of efficiency and resiliency. So technology continues to evolve. I have no basic qualm with technology as a component of the food system, but I would like to see technologies that are friendlier to the natural system, because up until now, most of the technologies that have been deployed are either neutral to the natural system or against the natural system. And there are very few technologies that I can point to. As a matter of fact, I can't name one off the top of my head, right, that I would say have been designed with the idea of optimizing natural systems as part of their mission, right? So if you want to create something in a lab, and it has a price and a value, more importantly than price, if it has a value that can be measured in the same way in which we measure food coming out of a natural system, have at it, right? But if I step back and look at this from a sociological perspective, one of the things that always concerns me is technology is controlled by somebody, right? And technology, by its very nature, is an intellectual property that is owned. And if you flipped a switch and we became the Jetsons, right? I don't know if you remember the Jetsons, but they
vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, it's an old cartoon. They could punch a button on a screen and food would come out on a tray, right? Or something that they would consume would come out on a tray. Somebody owns that system. So you've disenfranchised the food production system with that kind of technological, quote unquote, advancement, right? And that concerns me. It's kind of where we are today with a lot of the genetics, right? The genetics are largely owned by a few companies who are also the same people who sell us the chemicals that are designed to work with those genetics. That's their package, right? And if, God forbid, if you should save their seeds and try to plant them next year, they'll come after you.
Yeah.
They'll sue you, right? And so that's my concern about technology in the food system, is I think the food system is a part of a natural system that we should all be able to own without it being intervened upon by these, whoever it is that owns the technology. And so the farther we go into the technological realm of food production, that worries me from a sociological standpoint.
And we briefly touched upon it before, and the whole hype. I'm basically turning this into what do you think about all the aspects of Regen Ag? Because it's always so good to check in with you on the carbon hype. What are your feelings and thoughts there? Because you've been in this space for a while. That's why I'm asking these questions, and you have definitely shaped some interesting thoughts on many of those. Is it something like, to talk about another sector, let's say within food and ag, that got a lot of attention and interesting funding as well, to a certain extent, not as much as the plant-based and cellular ag space for sure, but what about the carbon focus, the soil carbon focus? Is that something that you're interested in or not, and if so, why?
Well, I'll be dating myself here a little bit. I was engaged in sort of the first round of the carbon soil sequestration back in the era of the Chicago Climate Exchange, right, in the mid and late 2005 to 2010, let's say, in that range. So I've been around this sector for a very long time, and I still see many of the same discussions happening today that were happening back then. There's a question of a term that's called additionality, right? How do we prove that what somebody has done has made a carbon benefit that wouldn't have occurred naturally, or it wasn't already occurring, right? So there's a measurement component, there's an additionality component, there's a permanence component, right? How do we know that carbon that is sequestered sticks around, right? And so the carbon cycle is clearly an important component, as is the nutrient cycle, as is the water cycle, right? These are all very, very critical natural system cycles. I would say the interest in carbon today is largely because we've partially figured out how to monetize the carbon cycle, right? Whether or not it's good science behind it, I think is a question that needs to continue to be asked, right? Looking at it as a panacea for climate change solution, I think, is a fool's errand. I think that it's a part of an answer to a very large, broad problem, but it's not in and of itself going to be, the saving grace of the climate challenges that we are now facing. I think it's more important, quite frankly, from a nutrient perspective, right? Because soil carbon, organic carbon, as a component of a healthy soil microbiome is critical. So I'm more interested in part of that process in terms of creating more nutrient-rich foods.
Not as much at the exact quantity, and then create a credit to be sold. Yeah.
Right. And I think, to me, an inset idea around soil quality, carbon being one component, is a valid way to move. But we don't see very many companies willing to buy an inset idea as part of their supply chain. They'd rather buy credits because it's an offset.
They rather buy the offsets and not do the hard work in their supply chain and buy the
not do the hard work in the supply chain. So that also kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth, right? If we are really serious about this, the food buyers, the ingredient buyers, right, would be focused on an inset system as opposed to an offset system, and they'd get more serious than they are. Although I'm not trying to minimize. There have been some investments made by some companies, in a limited sense, and maybe they're just practicing on how to get better at this. So I don't mean to be entirely dismissive, but it is a very true general statement that there are very, very few procurement programs, that are insetting ecosystem services into their purchasing plans, right? And so it's I don't know. I'm sure we'll get better at all of this, but right now I think we still have a long, long ways to go.
And on the nutrient side, or the nutrient density side, For sure, I asked, but you were not involved in this specific work. Like, I always like to ask the $1 billion question. In this case, what would you do if you had to invest it? Of course, you are the chair of a foundation or an association, and the board chair, sorry, and the investment piece is maybe a bit further, but you are an entrepreneur at heart. And so what would you do if you had to put money to work? $1 billion is a lot of money, and at the same time, it's nothing. Sorry. So what would you do? I'm not looking at dollar amounts exactly. I'm just looking at priority areas. Where would you, with an investor hat on, for the people at home, you cannot see Eric, but he's wearing a hat. Let's say that's an investor hat. What would you do if you were forced to put $1 billion to work with a return profile? Could be different returns, very long term, etc. But at some point, it would be nice if some of this came back.
You always ask the tough questions, Koen. That's a difficult one. I'm so focused right now on research and then the frameworks in which that research gets quantified. So if you think about the area of true cost accounting, which is something that folks can study on their own time, but the concept is actually quite simple, even though the practice can be very challenging. The concept of making sure that all the pluses and minuses associated with any production system are accounted for, right? So you give credit where credit is due, right? You propose a cost where a cost is appropriate. The numbers may not be exactly right, but at least directionally you're getting something into an economic equation which largely doesn't exist today. And so I think that ultimately is where I would probably put $1 billion, although I would struggle trying to figure out exactly how the return component of that would work.
Maybe partly lobby to create the market, and then the rest follows investment. I don't know. I'm just speculating here.
Yeah, I mean, you could create a unique economic formula or set of formulas, right? That would be all encompassing, right? But how you sell that, right? In our current way of thinking about a return, it doesn't fit the model, right? The research doesn't fit the model because you're not trying to create intellectual property in research. In my opinion, publicly funded research would be ideal. So it's not the domain of the investor. But I think those are two huge categories that need investment. And I do not have a return profile that supports that from a VC perspective, right? So it's going to have to be foundational work, philanthropic family office work, government agency work, publicly funded stuff, and public-like funded programs to get to the bottom of those two things. I think that the true cost accounting is largely the elephant in the room because it addresses everything else that we've talked about, right? We're not valuing things that should be valued in our current economic equations. You can't find them on the balance sheet or in the income statement. You also can't find the costs on the balance sheet or the income statement of virtually any manufacturing or production system that I can think of. All those things are absent. So we keep talking in these platitudes, but yet we're stuck in this measuring framework that is very, very limiting in terms of creating true understanding. So that's the
answer to the other question. Yeah, what would you do if you had the magic power, the magic wand question? If you could change one thing overnight, what would it be, Eric?
True cost accounting. I would force all production systems into a true cost accounting, and it wouldn't be perfect. It's a continuous improvement project, right? The numbers we assign to certain things wouldn't be perfect, but at least they're numbers, because today they're all these things are zero, right? Water is worth nothing. Air is worth nothing. Soil is worth nothing.
Emissions are pretty close to nothing. Yeah,
are worth nothing. Human health is worth nothing, right? I mean, the nutrient component of food is worth nothing. You can just keep on going, whether it's an ecosystem outcome or whether it's a health outcome or whether it's an agriculture outcome. None of these things are in the equation. So my magic wand would be to convert the world to a true cost accounting system and enable through that system enable us to at least have the conversations about what are the values that we put on these things, positive or negative. It's not all negative, right? There's some very valuable positive things that should also be in the equations. But let's complete the exercise of creating an economic system that actually shows the full economics. Right? It doesn't stop short because it's convenient and it's easy to stop short.
I think it's a perfect way to end this check-in, this conversation. I want to thank you so much, obviously, for not retiring and continuing the work you do, and for taking the time here to share. I don't think it's the last time. We have regular people, if there's one thing about regular guests, they tend to become, or they tend to stay regular guests, let's say. They keep coming back. So I'm hoping for that, and obviously hoping for your insights, your work, and the great work you do in this space. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for giving us all a platform to have these conversations. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.